This is Dachau, the very first Nazi concentration camp, a place built in 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler came to power. At first, it was meant for political enemies, communists, socialists, and anyone who dared oppose the regime. But Dachau would soon become much more than that. It was the model, the blueprint for an entire system of terror that spread across Europe before Dachau. Prisons existed. But they were bound by laws, sentences, and courts. The Nazis wanted something different, something outside the law. A place where they could lock people away indefinitely, without trials, without rights. They called it Schutzhaft, protective custody. But in reality, it meant one thing: absolute control. The camp was placed just outside Munich, the so-called capital of the movement. This was where the Nazi Party was born, and where Hitler had staged his failed beer hall putsch. By building Dachau here, the Nazis sent a clear message. Their enemies would be crushed in the very heart of their new stronghold. At first, Dachau held political prisoners, communists, trade unionists, outspoken journalists. But soon, more groups were added. Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to swear allegiance to Hitler. Homosexual men, arrested under Germany's paragraph 175 law. Roma and Sinti communities. And of course, Jews, who became an ever-growing target, especially after the pogrom of Kristallnacht in 1938. But Dachau wasn't just a prison. It was the training ground for the entire SS camp system. Guards were sent here to learn how to run other camps. Here, the Nazis developed their methods: forced labor, endless roll calls, brutal punishments, and the system of prisoner functionaries called Kipos, inmates forced to control their fellow prisoners under threat of death. Everything that would later appear in Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz started here. The Nazis even used Dachau as propaganda. Foreign journalists and officials were sometimes allowed in. They were shown clean barracks, organized work crews, and smiling prisoners. A lie. Behind the staged tours, the reality was starvation, disease, beatings, and executions. A system designed not just to imprison, but to dehumanize. By the time World War II began in 1939, Dachau was already 6 years old. It had become an essential tool of Nazi rule, a place where enemies of the Reich were sent to vanish. It was no longer just for Germans. Prisoners now came from all across occupied Europe: Poles, Czechs, French resistance fighters, Soviet POWs, and more. And as the war dragged on, the camp only grew more brutal, more crowded, and more deadly. When American forces finally liberated Dachau in April of 1945, what they found shocked the world. Piles of corpses, mass graves, and survivors barely clinging to life. The name Dachau would forever stand as a symbol of Nazi cruelty. But to understand that day of liberation, we must first go back to the beginning, to 1933. When the camp was born and its terrible system first took shape. March 1933. Adolf Hitler had only been Chancellor of Germany for 6 weeks, but already the Nazi Party was moving quickly to silence its enemies. On March 22nd, Heinrich Himmler, then the police chief of Munich, announced the creation of a new kind of facility. He called it a concentration camp. The location? An abandoned munitions factory near the small Bavarian town of Dachau. It was meant to hold 5,000 prisoners. But over the next 12 years, Dachau would hold more than 200,000. The very first prisoners were mostly political opponents, communists, social democrats, trade union leaders, men who had spoken out against Hitler's rise to power. They were arrested, not for crimes, but for their beliefs, and they quickly learned that Dachau was not a prison. It was a place of fear, a place to break human beings. At first, conditions inside Dachau were chaotic. The guards were members of the SA, the brown shirts, who treated prisoners with random cruelty. But by 1934, things changed. After the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler shifted power from the SA to the SS, led by Himmler. From then on, Dachau was run by the SS. It became their laboratory, their school of terror. The SS commander who shaped Dachau was Theodor Eicke. He arrived in mid-1933, bringing strict discipline and ruthless order. Eicke established the rules, the punishments, and the routines that would define every Nazi camp. He introduced uniforms for prisoners. Coloured triangles sewn onto jackets identified each group: red for political prisoners, green for criminals, pink for homosexuals, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, and later, yellow for Jews. This system of labels stripped people of their names, reducing them to symbols. Under Eicke, Dachau became a place of strict, almost military order. Prisoners woke before dawn, lined up for roll call in the freezing cold, and marched to work details. Any small mistake, an untidy bed, a missing button, could mean a beating. Eicke trained his SS guards to show no mercy, to treat prisoners as enemies of the state, less than human. It was here that the SS learned how to run the machinery of repression. In the mid-1930s, Dachau became infamous across Germany. People whispered about it, about the beatings, the deaths, the disappearances, but many Germans accepted it. For them, Dachau was a warning. This is what happens if you oppose the Führer. The camp didn't just punish individuals, it terrorized an entire nation into silence. The camp also expanded its prisoner categories. By 1935, homosexual men were being sent here under paragraph 175. Jehovah's Witnesses arrived, their faith making them refuse to serve in the German army or swear loyalty to Hitler. Roma and Sinti families began to be imprisoned. The Nazi state was widening its definition of who did not belong. Life in Dachau was marked by endless work. Prisoners were forced to build roads, dig trenches, and perform pointless, back-breaking tasks. One infamous punishment was carrying heavy stones back and forth across the yard, work that exhausted prisoners to collapse, but served no purpose. It was labour designed not to build, but to break. By 1937, the camp was expanded. The old factory buildings were torn down. In their place, a new complex of barracks, watchtowers, and barbed wire was built. This new Dachau could hold more prisoners, tens of thousands. It was a clear signal. The Nazis weren't slowing down. They were preparing for something bigger. Then, in November 1938, came a turning point. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany were attacked and destroyed. In the aftermath, more than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to camps. Thousands of them arrived in Dachau. For the first time, Jews were imprisoned here in massive numbers. The camp was no longer just about silencing political enemies. It was becoming part of the Nazi project to persecute and ultimately destroy European Jewry. By the end of 1938, Dachau had already changed dramatically. What began as a makeshift prison for political opponents had become a fully organized instrument of terror. The SS had refined their methods, tested their system, and trained their men. Dachau had become the prototype, the model for a growing network of camps that would soon spread like a web across Europe. As the 1930s closed, the world moved closer to war, and Dachau stood ready to serve the Nazi state in ways more brutal and more deadly than ever before. In the next part of this story, we'll see how Dachau expanded during the war years, and how life inside the camp became even harsher for those trapped within its fences. This is Dachau in 1938. 5 years after it first opened, the camp had already transformed from a makeshift prison into a permanent institution. The Nazis had invested in new barracks, watchtowers, and electrified fences. The SS had perfected their rules of order, discipline, and brutality. Dachau was no longer an experiment. It was a working system. And now it was about to grow even more dangerous. In March of 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the so-called Anschluss. Almost overnight, Dachau received an influx of Austrian prisoners, politicians, intellectuals, Jews, and anyone the Nazis saw as an enemy in their new territory. Trains rolled in carrying men who had once been respected leaders in Vienna. Now they were stripped, beaten, and shoved into Dachau's barracks. Later that year, the Munich Agreement handed over parts of Czechoslovakia to Germany. Again, new prisoners arrived, Czechs who had resisted German expansion, and Jews who had been caught trying to flee. By the end of 1938, Dachau was no longer a camp for just Germans. It was becoming international. But the biggest turning point came in November 1938, Kristallnacht. Across Germany and Austria, Nazi mobs and stormtroopers unleashed violence against Jewish communities. Synagogues burned, shop windows were smashed, and Jewish families were terrorized in their homes. The pogrom was brutal, but it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the Nazis arrested around 30,000 Jewish men. Thousands of them were transported directly to Dachau. The arrival of so many Jewish prisoners marked a dark shift. Until then, Jews had been a minority inside Dachau, outnumbered by political prisoners and other targeted groups. But after Kristallnacht, they became a central focus of the camp system. Dachau, once designed mainly to silence political opposition, was now deeply tied to the Nazis' escalating persecution of Jews. Conditions inside the camp grew worse with every new wave of prisoners. The overcrowding was severe. Barracks built for a few hundred men now held thousands. Beds were crammed together, straw mattresses rotting with lice, disease spreading rapidly. Hunger became a daily torment. Prisoners were given a thin soup, a piece of bread, maybe a sliver of margarine. It was never enough, and starvation was constant. The SS grew harsher too. Guards beat prisoners for the smallest infractions. A missed button on a uniform. A bed not folded tightly enough. Even speaking without permission could mean being whipped or forced to stand motionless for hours. For newcomers, especially the Jews brought in after Kristallnacht, the camp was a place of immediate humiliation. Heads were shaved, possessions taken, and men were forced into exhausting labor designed to break them. Dachau also became a center of training for SS personnel. Guards from all over Germany came here to learn how to run other camps. What they practiced at Dachau, roll calls, punishments, forced labor, the use of prisoner functionaries, was exported across the growing camp network. Dachau was not only a prison, it was the SS school of cruelty. By 1939, the year the Second World War began, Dachau held around 6,000 prisoners. That number may sound small compared to the horrors that came later, but what mattered was the system. Dachau had proved it worked. The camp had become a symbol of Nazi power, a place every German feared. People knew, oppose the regime, speak too loudly, resist, and you could vanish behind Dachau's barbed wire. And outside the fences, the world was changing fast. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and war erupted across Europe. The role of Dachau, and camps like it, would expand again. No longer just tools of domestic terror, they would become engines of wartime exploitation, forced labor, and mass death. The early years of Dachau had built the foundation. By 1939, the machinery was in place, the guards were trained, the routines were set, the prisoners were broken. All that remained was to feed more and more victims into the system. What began in 1933 as a camp for a few thousand political opponents had now become something much larger. Dachau was ready to serve the war effort, ready to imprison resistance fighters from across Europe, ready to hold prisoners of war, ready to enforce the Nazis' vision of racial purity through fear, labor, and death. The stage was set for Dachau's most terrible years, the war years. When the camp swelled with prisoners from every corner of occupied Europe, when death became a daily reality, and when Dachau's name would become forever linked to suffering on an unimaginable scale. Imagine waking up before dawn in a freezing wooden barrack crammed with hundreds of other men. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, sickness and despair. You haven't eaten enough in weeks, your stomach aches with hunger, and before you can even gather your thoughts, a whistle blows. The SS are shouting, "It's time to line up." This was daily life inside Dachau. Every morning began with roll call. Prisoners had to rush outside, often in the dark, and stand in rows in the Appellplatz, the roll call square. It didn't matter if it was raining, snowing, or burning hot. Everyone had to stand perfectly still, sometimes for hours, while guards counted them again and again. If a prisoner had died during the night, his corpse had to be dragged out and lined up with the others. If the numbers didn't add up, the punishment was brutal. The entire camp might be forced to stand for the whole day without food or water until the SS were satisfied. After roll call, prisoners were sent to work. Forced labour was central to Dachau. Some were assigned to construction, building roads, digging trenches, hauling stones from one side of the yard to the other. Others worked in camp workshops, producing uniforms, repairing equipment, or even crafting furniture for the SS. By the war years, Dachau had dozens of sub-camps connected to German industries, where prisoners were forced to work in factories, armaments plants and quarries. The labour was deliberately exhausting. Prisoners were pushed until they collapsed. Guards beat them if they slowed down. Sometimes the work was pointless, carrying heavy stones back and forth all day only to return them to the same place. This wasn't about productivity. It was about breaking people, reducing them to tools of suffering. Food was scarce, and hunger gnawed constantly. Breakfast was usually nothing more than a piece of stale bread with weak coffee or a watery substitute. Lunch might be thin soup made of turnips or cabbage, often spoiled. Dinner was another slice of bread, maybe a smear of margarine or sausage if you were lucky. The rations never matched the calories burned through hard labour. Starvation was a constant companion, weakening bodies and minds. Disease thrived in the camp. Overcrowded barracks meant lice and fleas spread quickly. Tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery killed countless prisoners. Medical care was virtually non-existent for inmates. The camp's infirmary was little more than a place to wait for death, and for many being sent to the so-called hospital was a death sentence in itself, because it became the site of horrific medical experiments. SS doctors carried out brutal tests on prisoners in Dachau. Men were subjected to freezing experiments, plunged into ice water to see how long German pilots might survive after crashing into the sea. Others were tested in low-pressure chambers that simulated high altitudes, causing victims' lungs to collapse. Still others were injected with malaria or forced to test new drugs. Prisoners rarely survived these experiments, and if they did, they were left crippled for life. Punishment was everywhere in Dachau. Prisoners lived under constant threat. If someone was accused of breaking a rule, the penalties could be terrifying. One method was flogging, being whipped while bent over a wooden block. Another was hanging prisoners by their arms, tied behind their backs, dislocating their shoulders in excruciating pain. Some were forced to stand in punishment cells for days, without food or rest, and executions were carried out regularly, often by firing squad or hanging, in areas of the camp hidden from most prisoners but known by all. To maintain control, the SS relied on a system of prisoner functionaries. These were inmates, often criminals, or those considered trustworthy by the SS, who were given power over their fellow prisoners. Called kapos, they supervised work details and barracks, enforcing discipline with violence. This system turned prisoners against each other, creating fear, resentment, and division. For the SS, it was an effective way to rule by proxy. Despite the brutality, prisoners found small ways to survive, to cling to humanity. They shared food, whispered forbidden prayers, or secretly taught each other languages and skills. Some smuggled letters or news into the camp. Acts of kindness, though rare and dangerous, became lifelines of hope. But survival was always uncertain. Dachau was not designed to keep prisoners alive. Death was constant, whether from starvation, disease, beatings, or executions. By the early 1940s, corpses piled up faster than the crematorium ovens could burn them. New facilities were built, including a larger crematorium and a gas chamber, though the gas chamber at Dachau was not used for mass extermination on the scale of Auschwitz. It was part of the machinery of death. Prisoners lived in the shadow of it every day, never knowing if they would be taken there next. For Jewish prisoners especially, life was even harsher. They were singled out for the worst jobs, the heaviest labor, and the most violent treatment. The Nazis saw Dachau as part of their broader campaign of racial persecution, and Jews were always at the bottom of the camp's hierarchy. Religious figures were also targeted. Hundreds of Catholic priests, especially from Poland, were imprisoned in Dachau. The camp became known as the largest monastery in the world, not because faith was practiced freely, but because so many clergy were held captive. Many of them died, but others managed to keep their faith alive in secret, offering comfort to fellow prisoners in hushed voices after lights out. Every evening ended the same way it began, with roll call. Again, prisoners were lined up, counted, and inspected. Again, bodies of the dead were displayed alongside the living. After hours of forced labor, men stood for long stretches in the square, often too weak to remain upright. Collapsing during roll call could mean being beaten or dragged away, never to return. Finally, prisoners were herded back into their barracks. Packed together in rows of wooden bunks, they lay awake in the dark, listening to coughing, crying, and the distant sound of guards' boots. Sleep offered little escape because every day was the same cycle of terror and exhaustion. This was the reality of daily life in Dachau. It was a world designed to crush individuality, to erase dignity, and to reduce human beings to mere numbers. Yet, even in this world of brutality, sparks of resistance and humanity endured. Prisoners who risked sharing food, those who whispered songs or prayers, those who simply refused to give up their will to live. They carried the fragile thread of hope through the darkest of nights. Dachau was more than just a prison camp. It was a machine of dehumanization. Every roll call, every beating, every spoon of watery soup was part of that machine. For 12 long years, it consumed tens of thousands of lives, and yet the worst was still to come. Because once war erupted across Europe, Dachau's population would explode. The camp would swell with prisoners from every conquered nation, resistance fighters, intellectuals, priests, Soviet soldiers, and countless Jews. Daily life, already unbearable, would descend into an even deeper nightmare. The war years would turn Dachau into something far larger and far deadlier than its early founders could have imagined. The system they had built to intimidate Germans would become a tool to terrorize the entire continent. When war broke out in September 1939, Dachau was already 6 years old. By then, it had held thousands of Germans, Austrians, and Czechs. But the war changed everything. Dachau would no longer be just a domestic tool of terror. It would become a prison for the enemies of the Reich from across an entire continent. As German armies swept across Europe, new prisoners poured into Dachau. Poles were among the first in massive numbers. Priests, professors, politicians, and anyone suspected of resisting Nazi rule in occupied Poland were rounded up and sent to camps. Thousands of them ended up in Dachau, where conditions quickly worsened under the flood of new arrivals. Soon after came prisoners from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other occupied territories. Resistance fighters, intellectuals, and civilians accused of sabotage or disobedience found themselves herded onto trains and shipped eastward into Germany. Many never even knew where they were being sent until they passed through Dachau's gates. By 1941, another group arrived, Soviet prisoners of war. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of captured Red Army soldiers were sent to camps. Dachau received thousands of them, and their treatment was some of the harshest of all. Many Soviet POWs were executed upon arrival, shot in secluded areas of the camp, or used for medical experiments. Those who were kept alive endured the same starvation and forced labor as everyone else, often with even less chance of survival. The international mix of prisoners made Dachau a strange, tragic mosaic. Germans, Poles, Czechs, French, Yugoslavs, Russians, Dutch, Belgians, Italians, and many more were crammed into the same barracks. Each group was marked with its coloured triangle badge: red, green, purple, pink, yellow. But no matter their category, every prisoner lived under the same suffocating system of roll calls, labour, and constant fear. The overcrowding became unbearable. Barracks designed for a few hundred prisoners now packed in thousands. Prisoners lay side by side on straw sacks, crawling with lice. Sanitation collapsed. Typhus and tuberculosis swept through the camp, killing men by the hundreds. The crematoriums worked constantly to burn the dead, but even they couldn't keep up. Piles of bodies grew near the barracks, grim reminders to the living of their likely fate. Forced labour expanded dramatically during the war. Dachau became the hub of a vast network of satellite camps, more than 140 in total, spread across southern Germany and Austria. Prisoners were sent to work in factories, mines, and armaments plants. Companies like BMW, Messerschmitt, and others used forced labour from Dachau to produce weapons and machinery for the Nazi war effort. Work was brutal. Prisoners laboured for 12 or more hours a day with almost no food. Many collapsed at their posts, beaten by guards if they slowed down. Injuries were common, and medical care was non-existent. A broken leg or a fever often meant death because the SS had no interest in prisoners who couldn't work. Inside the main camp, medical experiments intensified. SS doctors carried out horrific tests on prisoners in the name of science. Some were locked in low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions, suffering convulsions and organ failure. Others were deliberately frozen in ice water to study hypothermia, often dying in the process. Still others were injected with diseases like malaria to test new drugs. Dachau became a laboratory of cruelty, where human lives were treated as disposable test subjects. As the war dragged on, starvation deepened. Rations were cut further, and prisoners fought for scraps of bread or potato peels. Malnutrition left men skeletal, with swollen bellies and weakened immune systems. Death by hunger became as common as death by execution. And executions did not stop. Dachau had its own killing facilities, including a shooting range and a gallows. Thousands were executed quietly, away from the roll call square, their deaths recorded in SS logs, but often hidden from the outside world. Yet even in the darkest years, prisoners tried to resist in whatever ways they could. Some formed underground networks, sharing news from the outside world, spreading hope that the war might one day end. Others sabotaged their work, damaging machinery or slowing production. Acts of defiance were small, but they carried enormous risk. Discovery meant torture or death. Religion also became a quiet form of resistance. Dachau held thousands of Catholic priests, especially from Poland. They formed secret masses, whispered prayers, and tried to bring comfort to their fellow inmates. For many, faith was the only thing that gave them strength to endure another day. By 1944, as Germany began to lose the war, Dachau grew even more desperate. Prisoners from camps being evacuated in the east were forced into long, deadly marches toward Dachau. Survivors of Auschwitz and other extermination camps staggered into Dachau half-dead, swelling the camp's population far beyond its capacity. Disease exploded. Typhus killed thousands in a matter of weeks. The death toll in these final months was staggering. By the time of liberation in 1945, more than 30,000 prisoners had died in Dachau. Some estimates place the number even higher, especially when including the satellite camps. And yet the SS continued to enforce their brutal discipline until the very end. Prisoners were still lined up for roll call, still forced to work, still beaten and starved, even as Allied forces drew closer. For those inside Dachau, the war years were a living hell with no end in sight. But the end was coming. In April 1945, American forces advanced into Bavaria. The SS tried to evacuate prisoners from Dachau, sending thousands on death marches that killed many along the way. Those who remained behind in the camp would soon witness a moment they thought might never come: liberation. The war years had transformed Dachau from a single camp outside Munich into the center of a vast system of forced labor and death. What began in 1933 as a tool to silence political opponents had become, by 1945, a machine of suffering that reached across Europe. Dachau was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of Nazi cruelty, etched into the lives of over 200,000 prisoners who passed through its gates. And as the Allies closed in, the world would soon see the truth of what Dachau had become. The liberation of 1945 would reveal horrors beyond imagination, horrors that would haunt survivors and liberators alike for the rest of their lives. By the time the war reached its height, Dachau had become a place of constant death. Every corner of the camp carried the shadow of it. From the crematorium, where smoke rose daily from burning bodies, to the punishment blocks where men were tortured and executed, death was everywhere. It's estimated that more than 30,000 prisoners lost their lives in Dachau. The real number may be higher, and those deaths were not accidents of war. They were the result of deliberate policies, carried out by the SS with ruthless precision. Some prisoners died slowly, through starvation. Day after day, the meagre rations wore them down. A piece of bread, a bowl of watery soup, a few bites of turnip. That was all they had. Their bodies wasted away until they could no longer stand at roll call or lift the stones they were forced to carry. Guards watched them collapse, sometimes beating them as they fell. In the end, starvation claimed thousands. Disease was another silent executioner. Overcrowding, filth, and lack of sanitation turned Dachau into a breeding ground for illness. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis tore through the barracks. Prisoners lay in bunks burning with fever, untreated, abandoned. The SS doctors rarely offered care. More often they chose to use the sick for experiments, or simply left them to die. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, typhus alone was killing hundreds every week. Executions were carried out with chilling regularity. Dachau had a designated killing site, known as the shooting range or the execution wall, hidden in a grove near the camp. Prisoners were marched there under guard, lined up and shot. Others were hanged in the camp yard, their bodies left dangling as a warning to the living. Some were executed in groups, accused of sabotage or resistance. For the SS, it was all routine. The camp's crematoriums became factories of disposal. At first, Dachau had a small crematorium to burn the bodies of those who died from hunger or disease. But as the death toll grew, a larger crematorium was built in 1942, complete with multiple ovens. Next to it stood a gas chamber disguised as a shower room, with fake shower heads and airtight doors. The gas chamber at Dachau has long been a subject of debate. Unlike Auschwitz or Treblinka, it was not used for mass extermination on the same scale. But evidence shows that it was used for smaller groups of prisoners and for testing poison gas. Even when it wasn't used, its presence cast a constant terror over the camp. Prisoners knew it was there. They knew what it meant. Medical experiments added another layer of atrocity. In the name of science, SS doctors turned Dachau into a laboratory of human suffering. Prisoners were locked in low-pressure chambers to test the effects of high altitudes, simulating conditions for Luftwaffe pilots. Many died in agony, their lungs collapsing, their bodies convulsing. Others were submerged in freezing water to study hypothermia, left for hours until their hearts stopped. Prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, injected with experimental drugs, or forced to drink seawater in experiments on survival. Very few survived these trials, and those who did were often permanently scarred. Behind every experiment was the same chilling belief that prisoners were less than human, disposable tools for Nazi ambitions. The men and women who conducted these experiments later stood trial, but at the time they acted with complete freedom. Death also came in the form of forced marches. As the Allies advanced in 1945, the SS began evacuating camps in the east and moving prisoners toward Dachau. Thousands of men were forced to march for days or weeks with little food and no rest. Those who collapsed were shot on the spot. These so-called death marches killed countless prisoners before they even reached the camp. And for those who survived, Dachau was only another circle of hell. In the final weeks before liberation, Dachau reached its breaking point. Tens of thousands of prisoners crowded into the camp, many transferred from other camps that had been abandoned. Conditions collapsed completely. Food ran out. Sanitation broke down. Typhus spread like wildfire. The crematorium could no longer keep up, and corpses piled in heaps near the barracks. For the prisoners still alive, every day was a battle to survive one more hour. They shared scraps of bread, stole turnip peels from garbage, or risked their lives to sneak an extra sip of soup. Some clung to faith, others to friendship, and others simply to the raw will to live. But the odds were against them. Every day hundreds more died, and yet through all the death and atrocities, the human spirit refused to vanish entirely. Prisoners remembered birthdays in secret, recited poems, whispered songs, and supported each other whenever they could. Even in a place built to erase humanity, moments of compassion and resistance flickered like small flames in the dark. Still, Dachau remained a place of systematic cruelty until the very end. The SS carried out killings even as the Allies approached, determined to leave no witnesses. They tried to cover up evidence, burning documents, destroying records, but the truth of Dachau was too vast to hide. By April 1945, Dachau was a camp of death. Piles of corpses lay beside barracks. Typhus raged uncontrolled. The crematorium roared day and night. And still, more prisoners arrived from death marches, too weak to stand, collapsing at the gates. The atrocities of Dachau were not an accident of war. They were the direct result of a system designed to dehumanize, to exploit, and to kill. Dachau had begun as a place to silence political opponents, but by the end it had become a machine of death. A place where starvation, disease, executions, experiments, and neglect worked together to destroy human life on an industrial scale. When the camp was finally liberated, the world saw what had been hidden behind the barbed wire, and the name Dachau would forever be linked to the worst crimes of the Nazi regime. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Allied troops were advancing from the west, Soviet forces were closing in from the east, and Nazi Germany was only days away from surrender. But inside Dachau, tens of thousands of prisoners were still trapped in hell. In those final weeks, the camp was overflowing. Prisoners from other camps had been forced into Dachau during evacuation marches. Barracks built for a few hundred now held thousands. Typhus raged out of control. Food supplies had collapsed. Corpses lay in piles near the barracks, unburied, unburned, too many for the crematorium to handle. On April 26th, just 3 days before liberation, the SS began evacuating thousands of prisoners from Dachau itself. Around 7,000 men were forced onto a death march south toward the Alps. Anyone who collapsed was shot. Few survived the journey. Those left behind in the camp, sick, starving, too weak to walk, were left to face an uncertain fate. As the Americans advanced through Bavaria, rumors spread among prisoners. Liberation was close. Some dared to hope. Others were too weak to believe. Many thought they would be killed before the Allies arrived. On the morning of April 29, 1945, units of the US 42nd Infantry Division and the 45th Infantry Division approached Dachau. As they neared the camp, they made a gruesome discovery. Along the railway tracks outside the gates stood a train, what became known as the Death Train. It held the bodies of more than 2,000 prisoners evacuated from Buchenwald. They had been packed into rail cars without food or water for weeks. Most had died during the journey. The sight stunned even battle-hardened soldiers. When the Americans entered the camp itself, they were met with scenes of horror. Thousands of emaciated prisoners stumbled toward them, too weak to walk steadily, some barely alive. Everywhere they looked, there were corpses, stacked near the crematorium, sprawled in the barracks, lying in the roll call square. The smell of death hung in the air. Soldiers of the 42nd and 45th Divisions, along with the 20th Armoured Division, were overwhelmed by what they saw. Many had fought in fierce battles across Europe, but nothing had prepared them for Dachau. One liberator later said, "It was the most horrifying day of my life." The SS guards still in the camp quickly surrendered. Some tried to flee, but most were captured. In the chaos, enraged American soldiers and freed prisoners attacked SS men. Several dozen guards were killed on the spot. Later, these events were investigated, but at the time, the rage was uncontrollable. After seeing the evidence of mass death, few had any mercy left for the perpetrators. For the prisoners, liberation was both joy and agony. Some wept, collapsing into the arms of their liberators. Others could barely comprehend what was happening. Many were too weak to celebrate, their bodies ravaged beyond repair. Tragically, hundreds more would die in the days after liberation, too sick to recover even with medical care. American forces immediately brought in medical units to try to contain the typhus epidemic. They set up emergency hospitals, fed survivors carefully to avoid killing them with too much food too quickly, and did their best to restore order. Local civilians from the town of Dachau were forced to walk through the camp and witness what had been done in their name. Many claimed ignorance, but the evidence was undeniable. Newsreel cameras captured the scenes inside Dachau, and soon the world saw the reality of Nazi camps. Images of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, and crematorium ovens spread quickly, shocking audiences in the United States, Britain, and beyond. The liberation of Dachau became one of the most iconic moments in exposing the crimes of the Third Reich. For survivors, liberation was the beginning of another struggle, the struggle to rebuild lives shattered by years of suffering. Many had no homes to return to, no families left alive. Displaced persons camps were set up, where survivors waited months or even years before they could return to their countries or emigrate abroad. Some found refuge in America, Israel, or other nations. Others stayed in Germany, haunted by memories of Dachau. The liberators themselves were forever marked by what they saw. Many spoke of Dachau for the rest of their lives, remembering it as the moment when they truly understood the evil they had been fighting against. April 29, 1945, was the end of Dachau as a concentration camp, but it was not the end of its story. In the months and years that followed, the camp would take on a new role as a site of justice, memory, and reckoning. The crimes of Dachau would not be forgotten, and those responsible would face trial. Liberation turned Dachau from a place of death into a symbol of the worst crimes of Nazism and of the resilience of those who survived against all odds. The world had seen what had been hidden behind the barbed wire, and it could never look away again. When the gates of Dachau were opened on April 29, 1945, the world saw the horror of Nazi concentration camps with its own eyes. But liberation was not the end of the story. In the months and years that followed, Dachau became a place of justice, of memory, and eventually of remembrance. Right after liberation, the camp itself was turned into a temporary prison. SS guards, camp officials, and Nazi leaders captured by the Allies were held in the very barracks where their victims had once lived. For the first time, the roles were reversed. In November 1945, just months after the war ended, the US military began the Dachau trials. These were a series of military tribunals held inside the camp itself, aimed at bringing perpetrators of Nazi crimes to justice. Over the next 3 years, more than 1,600 defendants were tried here. SS guards, camp doctors, commandants, and others connected to the camp system. The most famous of these trials was the Dachau main trial, held in late 1945. 40 individuals were charged with war crimes committed in the camp. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from survivors, documents left behind, and the physical remains of the camp itself. 36 of the accused were found guilty. 23 were sentenced to death by hanging. Other trials followed, covering crimes not only in Dachau but also in other concentration camps, in occupied territories, and even against prisoners of war. Some sentences were reduced over time, and not every guilty party was punished as harshly as survivors might have hoped. But the Dachau trials marked one of the first large-scale efforts to hold Nazi perpetrators accountable. For survivors, testifying in these trials was both painful and necessary. They spoke about beatings, starvation, executions, and experiments. They told the world what life inside Dachau had been like. Their words preserved the memory of the victims and helped ensure the crimes could never be denied. After the trials, Dachau's story did not end. For years, the camp was repurposed. In the late 1940s, it housed German prisoners of war. Later, it became a refugee camp for those displaced by the war, people with no homes to return to, survivors searching for a new start, families broken by the Holocaust. It wasn't until 1965, 20 years after liberation, that Dachau officially became a memorial site. Survivors played a leading role in making this happen. They demanded that the world remember, that the site not be erased or forgotten. Their persistence turned Dachau into one of the first concentration camps to be preserved as a place of memory. Today, Dachau is visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. The barracks, the roll call square, the crematorium, and the museum all stand as reminders of what happened there. Signs and exhibits tell the story of the prisoners, the SS, and the liberation. The gate still bears the cruel words "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free, a chilling reminder of the lies used to mask the truth of the camp. For survivors, Dachau remained a scar. Many never spoke openly about their experiences until decades later. Others dedicated their lives to education, returning to the camp to tell their stories to new generations. Their testimonies became some of the most powerful weapons against denial and forgetting. The legacy of Dachau extends beyond Germany. It became a symbol in the wider world of what unchecked hatred, dictatorship, and dehumanization can create. For Americans, the liberation of Dachau was a defining moment of World War II, one that shaped how the Holocaust was remembered in the United States. For Europeans, it was a reminder that such crimes had taken place not in some faraway land, but in their own backyards. The memory of Dachau continues to shape how we think about human rights, justice, and the dangers of extremism. Standing in the camp today, you can still feel the weight of history. The long rows of barracks foundations, the barbed wire, the crematorium, all speak silently of the lives lost here. The survivors, many now gone, left us a responsibility to remember not just the crimes of Dachau, but the people who endured them, to remember the cruelty of the SS, but also the resilience of the prisoners. To remember that Dachau was not only the first concentration camp, but the model that spread across Europe, claiming millions of lives. The Dachau trials showed the world that justice, however imperfect, was possible. The Dachau Memorial shows us that memory is necessary. And the story of Dachau warns us what can happen when hatred is allowed to rule unchecked. From 1933 to 1945, Dachau was a place of fear, suffering, and death. From 1945 onward, it became something else, a warning carved in stone and memory for all who come after. The legacy of Dachau is not just about the past, it is about the present and the future. It is about ensuring that such a place can never exist again. From its opening in 1933 to its liberation in 1945, Dachau stood as a symbol of Nazi power. It was the first camp, the model camp, the place where the SS developed and perfected their system of oppression. More than 200,000 prisoners passed through its gates. At least 30,000 never came out alive. Dachau began as a tool to silence political opposition, but it grew into something far larger, a central pillar of the Nazi state. It imprisoned Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, clergy, resistance fighters, and prisoners of war. It trained the guards who would go on to run Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and so many other camps. It became both a place of suffering and a prototype for mass terror. Walking through Dachau today, you see the remnants of that system. The roll call square, where prisoners once stood for hours. The barracks foundations, where thousands crammed together in filth and disease. The crematorium, where the dead were burned day and night. And the infamous gate with its cruel slogan, Arbeit macht frei. But Dachau is more than ruins. It is a lesson, a warning, a place where history speaks directly to us. The lesson is simple, yet profound. This was not inevitable. Dachau was built by choices, choices made by individuals, by leaders, by followers, by neighbors. It happened because hatred was tolerated, because silence prevailed, because cruelty was normalized. And if those forces are allowed to rise again, such horrors can happen again. The warning is clear. Democracy, freedom, and human rights are fragile. They must be protected every day, or else they can vanish, replaced by fear and violence. Dachau shows what happens when power is unchecked, when ideology dehumanizes, and when a society accepts the persecution of its neighbors. And the memory is powerful. Even in the darkest times, humanity can endure. Survivors of Dachau carried scars, but they also carried strength. They rebuilt lives. They told their stories. They fought to make sure the world would not forget. Their courage turned Dachau from a place of death into a place of remembrance. When American soldiers entered Dachau on April 29, 1945, they were not just liberating a camp. They were bearing witness. Their photographs, their testimonies, and their memories ensured that the crimes of Dachau could never be hidden. Survivors joined them in that duty, speaking across generations, reminding us of what they endured and why it must never happen again. So when we remember Dachau today, we do not only mourn the victims, we also honor the survivors. We honor their resistance, their resilience, and their determination to preserve memory. The story of Dachau is the story of how a society can descend into brutality, and how individuals can survive even the most inhuman conditions. It is a story of loss, but also of responsibility. Responsibility for us, here and now, to ensure that hatred, prejudice, and tyranny are challenged wherever they appear. From the first prisoners in 1933 to the liberation in 1945, Dachau's history stretches across the entire Nazi era. It began as the seed of a system and ended as a symbol of its destruction. Today, it stands as one of the most visited memorial sites in the world. Every visitor, every student, every survivor who walked through its gates after the war became part of its second story, the story of remembering. Because Dachau is not just about what was, it is about what must never be again. The survivors often said, "never again," not just for themselves, not just for Jews, not just for Germans, but for humanity. Never again should concentration camps rise. Never again should people be persecuted for who they are. Never again should silence allow evil to thrive. This is Dachau's legacy, a place where the worst of humanity was revealed, and where the duty of memory was born. And that is why we tell this story. That is why we remember. That is why Dachau, though it closed in 1945, will never truly be forgotten. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.